Welcome everyone to TCPA Regulatory Update, FCC's rulemaking of June 18, 2015. All lines will be placed on mute to prevent any background noise. Thank you. Carl Koster and Tom Miller, you can begin your webinar.
Thank you, Mandy. And thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar, which, as Mandy mentioned, will focus on the TCPA update, specifically the FCC's rulemaking of June 18th. My name is Tom Miller, and I'm a Vice President of Solutions here at Noble Systems. Today's webinar is part of Noble Systems' Compliance Webinar Series, which continues next week, Thursday, September 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern, with a follow-on webinar focused on Noble Systems' compliance-ready contact solutions for those that have not already had an opportunity to participate. Today I'm joined by Carl Koster, Chief Intellectual Property and Compliance Counsel for Noble Systems. And I'll now turn it over to Carl to introduce himself and get us started on our presentation.
Thank you, Tom. I should first provide the mandatory disclaimer that anything that's provided herein shouldn't be construed as legal advice, nor establishing any sort of client-attorney relationship. And as always, you should always consult with your own attorney to evaluate the risk under the TCPA of using any vendor's product in your call center. Okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, why don't we get started into looking at the FCC's TCPA order. The actual text of the order was released July 10th, and there were a number of topics they addressed in there. These are some of the topics we're going to cover. But the first topic, the scope and definition of an autodialer, was by far foremost the most controversial and aspect of the order that everyone was wanting to see what the FCC was saying. So let's jump in there right away. The definition of an autodialer was clarified by the FCC's order, but let's go back and look at the statutory definition of an autodialer. The statutory defines the term automatic telephone dialing system, or autodialer, as equipment which has the capacity A, to store or produce telephone numbers to be called using a random or sequential number generator, and B, to dial such numbers. Now, the key word which generated so much interest by the FCC and the industry is the meaning of the word capacity. And the meaning of this word basically fell into two different interpretations. There was the interpretation that it meant present capacity, and actually under this category there were two different subcategories. One was that it was a present capacity that was actually used for making the current call in question. The other interpretation of present capacity was that the capability was present in an dialer, but it was not used for making the current call. Both of those can be considered as variations of present capacity. The other interpretation of the word capacity was potential capacity. And in this case, there were actually also two subcategories that the FCC brought to our attention. One is the theoretical potential. Those are the FCC words. And I think of it as could be modified. Yes, it's theoretically possible. The other definition, which is more of interest, is the potential ability, which I think of it as the practically modifiable. The equipment is practically modifiable to have that capacity. Let's look at these a little bit closer. Going back to the present capacity actually used for the current call. What's interesting about this interpretation is that this originally was the FCC's interpretation of the word capacity in a 1992 order. And this was shortly after the TCPA was passed in 1991. And the FCC said functions like speed dialing didn't fall in the prohibitions of an autodialer because the numbers called are not generated in a random or sequential fashion. The underlying text, because the numbers called are not generated in a random or sequential fashion, is the reason at that time that the FCC said speed dialing was not prohibited as an autodial call. Interestingly, the FCC's order reaffirms the conclusion that speed dialing is not an auto-dialed call, but it disavows the reasoning. It doesn't adopt this as the reasoning, and it hasn't adopted it in the prior orders in 2007, 2003. The other interpretation of present capacity that the industry would have been perfectly happy with is that it's present in the equipment, but it wasn't used. The equipment could have used it, but it didn't. We would have been happy with this, the industry would have been happy with this because no one really dials calls anymore randomly or using a sequential number generator, and the software could be easily and has been removed from dialers so that it didn't have that present capacity. However, as you probably know and mentioned, the FCC instead decided to adopt a potential capacity interpretation. They realized that there is the theoretical potential where something or anything could be modified. That was recognized previously as one possible interpretation by the courts. And I think this is a great quote from a case in Alabama, Hunt versus 21st Mortgage Corp., where the judge said regarding the interpretation of capacity as being a potential capacity, he said, virtually every telephone in existence, given a team of sophisticated engineers working doggedly to modify it, could possibly store or produce numbers using a random or sequential number generator. In other words, the judge realized anything can be modified given enough skill, time, and money. The engineers can do anything. The FCC has recognized this as well. They said it a little bit more eloquently by saying the outer contours of the definition of autodialer do not extend to every piece of malleable and modifiable dialing equipment that conceivably could be considered to have some capacity, however small, to sort and dial telephone numbers. Well, that's great. All that tells us at the moment is that not everything is necessarily modifiable. They have helped us in giving us a concrete example of where the limits are more theoretical than practical. And this is a rotary phone. They've said such a possibility is too attenuated for us to find that a rotary dial telephone or phone has the requisite capacity and therefore is an autodialer. So we know that this, while yes, you could potentially modify a rotary phone, is just too theoretical and therefore it's not within the scope of an autodialer. It turns out that this does help us, as we see in our analysis to an extent. What the FCC has said is that if equipment has the potential ability, if it's practically modifiable, then it may be an autodialer. What did they say specifically on this? They said that a piece of equipment can possess the requisite capacity to satisfy the statutory definition of autodialer, even if, for example, it requires the addition of software to actually perform the functions described in the definition. But there must be more than a theoretical potential that the equipment could be modified to satisfy the autodialer definition. In other words, if you have to make a lot of changes to add that software, it's not an autodialer. But if you could add software perhaps easily or readily, then it may be an autodialer. Well, where exactly is that boundary between things that can receive or download software and a rotary phone? Well, unfortunately, as much as the industry was seeking clarification of what is and isn't an autodialer, the FCC has declined to, at this time, address the exact contours of the autodialer definition or seek to determine comprehensively each type of equipment that falls within that definition that would be administrable industry-wide. Again, that's rather eloquently stated that we're not going to tell you the specifics. So what do? Well, we try to pull from the order various hints as to where roughly this boundary lies. We do know that the FCC in its order has said equipment can possess the requisite capacity to satisfy the statutory definition of autodialer, even if, for example, it requires the addition of software to actually perform the functions described in the definition. So if you could add software to perform the functions, such as predictive dialing or dialing from a random or sequential number generator or from a list, if you could add that software, it may be an autodialer. On the other hand, the order also tells us, using an analogy of a stadium, one of the commissioners said, well, if you read the capacity in such a broad way, he said an 80,000 seat stadium could have the capacity to hold 104,000 people. And the order says, well, that's an inapt analogy because modern dialing equipment can often be modified remotely without the effort and cost of adding physical space to an existing structure. Indeed, adding space to accommodate 25% more people to a building is the type of mere theoretical modification that is insufficient to sweep it into our interpretation of capacity. The FCC is kind of mixing analogies of dialers and buildings, but I think what we can gather from this is that if you're going to have to make physical changes to the equipment to turn it into, to give it the capacity, then those physical changes are just too theoretical. And you can analogize this to the rotary phone. You would have to make a lot of physical changes to a rotary phone in order to give it the capacity to receive software and perform these functions. So, and another hint that we receive from the order is, again, they talk about potential functionalities of equipment that can be configured, and the footnote is particularly useful. It says the functional capacity of software-controlled equipment is designed to be flexible, both in terms of features that can be activated or deactivated, and in terms of features that can be added to the equipment's overall functionality through software changes or updates. So if equipment is designed to be flexible and it's designed to have new features activated or deactivated through software changes or updates, that again potentially could be an autodialer. So where does that leave us? Well, if a device can originate calls and readily receive software updates, that may be enough to give it the potential ability that the FCC talked about. It may be an autodialer. In addition, if we require hardware modifications to a device, that appears to put it in the realm of theoretical potential. It's just not practical. And that takes it out of the scope of an autodialer. Other factors that may be relevant that the order talks about, but these are not dispositive factors. In other words, they're not bright line tests. They're things to consider, and they may sway the conclusion one way or the other. The FCC declined to say that if human intervention is involved, it's therefore not an autodialer. They said, no, we're going to have to look at that by case determination. But if human intervention is involved, it supports the argument that it's not an autodialer. On the other hand, equipment that can dial a set of numbers or a list of numbers, that suggests it could be an autodialer. And the FCC has repeatedly stated in its orders that it's concerned about the capacity of equipment to dial thousands of numbers in a short period of time. And I interpret that to be equipment that can generate on its own the ability to dial thousands of numbers in a short period of time, as opposed to, for example, a switch in a large city which may serve thousands of customers, and if they each pick up their phone at the same time, they could dial thousands of calls. I don't think that's what the FCC was talking about. I think they were concerned about equipment that by itself could dial those numbers. We do know from the order that manual dialing is okay. Well, that may not seem very useful, but it actually is. Let's look at this a little bit more. We know manual dialing is okay. How does manual dialing work? Well, here's a picture of a rotary phone connected to a telephone carrier. I show it as connected to a telco switch. Why isn't this not okay? Why isn't this using an autodialer? We note that the telco switch is a computer-based dialer. The telco switch does have the ability to receive software updates. Indeed, that's how telephone companies do update their switches, is through software updates. But it's clear that while the switch has this capability, the user doesn't possess or control the telco switch. The user has no ability or control to load software or to modify the telco switch. So we know manual dialing is okay, and this, I submit this seems like a reasonable reason why it's okay. Otherwise, using a standard rotary phone with a telephone switch would be considered an auto dial call, and of course the FCC has said no, that's not the case. What about a DTMF touch-tone type phone? Now, the FCC didn't directly address this particular case when they talked about manual dialing, but I would submit that just like a rotary phone, the user can't readily load software into a DTMF phone, even if it is microprocessor controlled. They usually can't readily do that, and even if they can, it doesn't seem really feasible that you could turn that into a dialer that is capable of dialing thousands of calls. I think you'd probably have to add more processing power, more memory, and some other physical modifications. So let's assume for the moment using a DTMF phone is okay. Let's go to another example. In this case, we know that the FCC has said this is an auto dialer. Not the wireless switch, not the radio infrastructure, but the smartphone. FCC has said this, that this is an auto dialer because it's a device capable of dialing a call, and it's capable of readily receiving a software upgrade. I don't know if anyone has actually made an application to do random or sequential number dialing, but certainly it's feasible that that could be defined. Okay, let's look at one other thing that the FCC has told us. We know that the FCC has reaffirmed in their order that a predictive dialer is an auto dialer. And this is one example of how you would connect a predictive dialer up to a telephone network, and you would have a device used by an agent. Here I showed as a rotary touch-tone phone. The FCC has said the predictive dialer is an auto dialer because it is capable of receiving software upgrades to dial numbers using a random or sequential number generator. Even though we don't do that as an industry, it has that capacity. Okay. And furthermore, the user has possession and control of the predictive dialer. Software can be downloaded. They can't make the same arguments with respect to the telco switch, which is out of their possession and control. So let's look about the next architecture. This is where I think it gets interesting. The FCC did not address this particular architecture, but the question arises, is this a safe architecture for a contact center to use to originate calls to wireless numbers? Just like the prior slide that showed a predictive dialer, instead we have a PBX. And we all know that it's a computer-controlled dialing device capable of receiving software upgrades. And furthermore, the user has possession and control of the PBX. They don't have possession and control of the telco switch, but they do with the PBX. And the PBX could receive software downloads. In fact, that's typically how their capabilities are upgraded. So, is this safe? I would question that if a predictive dialer is an auto dialer and a smartphone is an auto dialer, it would appear that this may be risky to use this architecture to dial wireless numbers. Well, how do we solve this problem? Well, one potential solution is to convert that PBX or switching device into a locked down PBX. In other words, this is a device specially configured via hardware so that no software can be downloaded by the user to perform the prohibited functions. So that essentially the user has no ability for the to download software. They have no capacity using that device, which we call the compliance appliance, to dial from a list, perform predictive dialing, or generate telephone numbers using a random or sequential number generator. The user may have possession of the compliance appliance, but they don't have control. It is a black box similar to the telco switch in that they can't control downloading of software or what features are to be added to it. It's not a flexible device. Another potential solution for those individuals who seek a service as opposed to a premise-based solution is to put that compliance appliance in a cloud, and that's one configuration that we offer, which is to put it in the cloud. In this case, the user has neither control nor possession. So this is an effective argument to say the user has no ability to control software that to be downloaded on that device. These architectures are useful for avoiding the auto dialer definition when dialing wireless numbers. But that by itself is not sufficient. The TCPA's auto dialer prohibition is only one regulation that contact centers need to follow. They have a host of other regulations that have to be followed. They have to ensure that dialed numbers are not on a do not call list. They have to ensure that the dialed number is within an allowable calling window. If you use this architecture to dial wireless numbers, frequently the number is not indicative of where that person is. They may have a West Coast number but have moved to the East Coast. And so how do you know when you originate a call you're within the allowable calling window? Just manually dialing using a phone with a switching device isn't going to help the agent make that determination. You have to ensure that the dial attempts are within limits. There may be various contact center policies and there are various state laws, regulations that can limit how many times you can dial a number or an account with a certain time period. You have to ensure that if the call is being recorded, that you're going to comply with state requirements. Many states require two-party consent, so you have to know what state you're calling into and what the regulation is prior to activating call recording. You want to make obviously sure your calls are dispositioned correctly. You'd like to also potentially detect if the agent misdialed a manual call. The above architecture that it helps us avoid using an auto dialer, but it doesn't help us perform these additional compliance-related functions. To do that, Noble Systems has a wireless compliance solution that we believe fulfills both the TCPA auto dialer requirements and the other compliance requirements in other regulations. This is how it works. We have on the top a TCPA wireless compliance server. This device stores numbers. There's no doubt about it. There is a dialing list that is loaded by the call center operator, and it will contain various numbers that are stored. The compliance server will select a number, perform various compliance checks on that number, such as number of attempts, do not calling, calling windows, and so forth. Once that number passes the test, it's presented, it's sent to a computer display that sits on the agent's desk and displays the number that has passed that compliance check. The agent looks at that number, turns around, using a phone, manually dials that number using our compliance appliance. So they enter in that number that was just presented to them. The TCPA compliance appliance, which has been locked down, so to speak, receives that number, and it will notify the compliance server of the number that this agent just dialed. What that does, it allows the compliance server to compare this number with the number that it just previously presented to the agent. So the compliance server now knows that the number presented to the agent was actually dialed by the agent. It does this without actually making or handling the call. After the compliance server is notified of the call, it will confirm or authorize the receipt of that information to the compliance appliance, which then continues setting up the call to the wireless carrier. The important part about this architecture is the equipment that stores the number, which is the compliance server and the computer, which displays it even though for a short time it does store it. That equipment is separate from equipment that dials the number and handles the call. And quite clearly, the equipment that stores the number on the top doesn't handle the call, doesn't dial the call. The equipment on the bottom, which does dial the number and it does process the call, doesn't store the number. And further, the combination of this equipment ensures that the agent is maintaining compliance for calling windows, call attempts, missed dials, do not call, and all the other requirements that may be imposed. So we think that this solution, and further, I should add that the compliance appliance is defined so that it doesn't have the capacity. So it's safe to dial wireless numbers using the equipment on the bottom portion, which does not store the number, and yet the equipment on the top, which does store the number, does all the compliance checking. So you can see how keeping these equipment separated ensures that we're minimizing risk under the TCPA. And I'm happy to add that the interaction between that compliance server and the compliance appliance is the subject of several Noble System patents, which are public record, and you can look those up at the patent office if you so desire. Okay, I think that pretty much addresses the auto dialer requirement, how our equipment minimizes risk under the new FCC's order. Let's quickly go on to consent. With consent, the FCC has said that consent follows a number when it's ported. So if you obtain consent for a wireline number and the user ports to wireless with that same number, you're safe. You have consent. On the other hand, if you don't have consent and they port their wireline number to a wireless carrier, you don't have consent. If you dial it with an auto dialer, you're now in violation of the TCPA. Best practices, get consent on all numbers. Make it a practice. The FCC order also has said that consent can be obtained by the call party giving express, oral, or written consent, or in the absence of instructions to the contrary, by giving his or her wireless number to the person initiating the auto dialer pre-recorded call. So providing your number on a form is sufficient express written consent. However, note, this is for non-telemarketing advertising calls. If it is a telemarketing or advertising call, the requirements for consent is more stringent. And the difference, merely because the user filled out a form and indicated their wireless number, may not be sufficient consent if you're going to make an advertising call. And the difference between an advertising call and non-advertising call is subtle. If you were to, for example, generate an automated call saying your appointment reminder is tomorrow at 9 a.m., that's informational. If you call to say our store hours have changed, that's informational. If you include the phrase, and while you're here, check out our new special offers, you've now transformed that into a telemarketing advertising call. And so you have to be very careful with that distinction. Revocation for consent is just as important. Bottom line is any reasonable means that an individual revokes their consent must be accommodated. You can't just say, oh, you have to fax that in to this number, otherwise we can't honor your request. No. Any reasonable means, that means you're going to probably have to accommodate a variety of mechanisms, even if the person walks into a store payment location and tells an employee, I revoke my consent, that's reasonable. Best practice, keep a record of consent or revocation of consent whenever it's given. You may need that to prove that if you're in litigation. Reassigned numbers, or who is the call party, was probably the second most contentious issue in the order. The FCC has said called party, that means the current subscriber or user of a number. So, by the way, if the telephone, for example, is paid for by an employer, but it's used by an employee, the employee, though technically not the subscriber, is still the user of the number. Good news, the first call to a reassigned wireless number, there's no liability. So if you haven't called this number for a while and it's reassigned to a new subscriber, you probably don't have consent to call that subscriber. No liability. Thereafter, there may be liability. You may receive actual notice that the number has been changed when you call that number. Your first attempt may result in an intercept tone that tells you the number is not in service, or you may get a voicemail greeting. The call may be answered. You're calling John Doe, and the message says, "Hi, I'm Jane Smith. Please leave a message." You know that that's not John Doe. Or Jane Smith may actually answer the call and say, "Oh, this is John Doe's former number. This isn't his number anymore." If that happens, you need to act on it. You have received either actual or constructive notice that the call is no longer associated with that previous subscriber. If you continue making calls, you will potentially incur liability. So best practices, make sure that your agents and systems will honor these requests. Don't ignore them. There is a clear solution. This liability occurs if you use an auto dialer. So don't use an auto dialer. Use a manual dialing solution such as the one we just discussed. Text messages as calls. Briefly, no relief. We were not thinking this was going to happen. Some petitioners had asked that text messages are exempt from the TCPA, or they're not covered by the TCPA, rather, because they're not calls. Sorry, the FCC has reaffirmed the position that text messages are calls. Further, if you send texts by sending an email to a gateway that converts it to SMS, that's covered. You need consent now to send text via an email message. One bit of good news is merchants that may, for example, advertise text to this address to request a coupon discount or some other information. You can respond back to that without liability. A response is considered fulfilling that request. So if you want to do such type of promotions, feel free to. However, that only applies to the first response. You can't then capture that originating number and then send subsequent messages. Some other miscellaneous aspects. The FCC has clarified that who makes a text call is determined by who controls the recipients, the timing, and the content of the call. This was relevant for situations where you may have various service providers involved in sending a text-based message. There was a rather special category, new category of robocalls allowed for inmate calling services. Specifically, robocalls can be instituted to coordinate billing arrangements for calls originating in a penitentiary or other similar facility. The FCC also reaffirmed that it has defined some exempt service applications. This is interesting. There are allowed applications that are exempt from the TCPA. In other words, there are certain instances where for banking and healthcare and actually package notification services, you can send a text message without the recipient's consent, without incurring liability. The flip side is that you also have to follow a whole new set of rules that the FCC has defined that limit the time, manner, place, and number of messages that you can send under these exemptions. So it's carefully controlled, but there are these exemptions, but they're specifically for certain applications. The FCC has also authorized the carriers to go ahead and offer call blocking technology to block calls on behalf of their subscribers. it's unclear actually how this would work and whether the carriers would be motivated to offer this. However, people were asking whether or not this could be offered, and the FCC has given the green light to do that. Well, with that kind of covers my overview of some of the high points of the FCC order, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Carl. As I mentioned at the beginning of this call, next Thursday, September 3rd at 1 Eastern, we'll present a second webinar in our compliance series, and that one's focused on compliance-ready contact solutions. In next week's webinar, we'll discuss specifics on how Noble's technology is helping our customers maintain compliance with this new TCPA regulation, including more specifics on our TCPA solution. That's giving customers the ability to not only dial a number in a manual mode, but as Carl mentioned, in a compliant mode as well, and allowing customers the ability to achieve additional compliance by enforcing all the standard compliance criteria available for Noble systems. We'll also discuss in a little more detail the TCPA lockdown that we covered today, feature, integration with our other Noble solutions, and new offerings, including wireless scrubbing service and a litigator database. And then finally, we'll share opportunities to recoup some of the productivity loss that sort of resulted from the TCPA rulings and some of the move away from automation. And we'll share how to take advantage of that through the use of Noble's analytic applications. Now, I think we've got a few minutes left, so why don't we use our remaining time to address some of the questions that were submitted in advance. And Carl, I'll turn it back to you for any final Q&A.
Okay, there are a few questions I'd like to address. A number of questions have come in about the impact of the order with respect to certain organizations or types of call. For example, how does this order impact us if we're a nonprofit or making political type calls or healthcare related calls? How does the auto dialer definition impact us? The definition of the auto dialer is independent of the type of call, whether it's a nonprofit solicitation or a political survey. The TCPA prohibition of dialing wireless numbers using an auto dialer applies blanket-wide to all companies for all purposes except for emergency calls. So there are no exceptions here for nonprofits or healthcare organizations or so forth, except for the special exemptions for package delivery notification and healthcare and banking, but that's an exception. A number of questions have also asked about determining whether a phone number or how a phone number has been reassigned and when that has happened. Noble Systems equipment does have the ability to make a query to an external database where that could be checked. However, it doesn't appear that there's any definitive database out there that's maintained with the status of numbers. A lot of these numbers are controlled by carriers, and they don't always make that information public. Consequently, there are some service providers that purport that they can provide a high accuracy with respect to the indication of a number, but it's generally recognized that there's nothing that's definitive. Consequently, the best defense seems to be, one, don't use an auto dialer, use a manual dialer, and second of all, as soon as you find out the number has been reassigned, either by the person telling you or encountering an intercept tone or some other information, stop dialing that number with a predictive dialer. And you may not be able to avoid risk completely, but you certainly can minimize it. Another question, which is, I think, very good, and this is, I think, been modified with respect to this new order, and that is the question involving the use of soft phones. Many call center operators use soft phones, that is software running on a desktop computer to essentially allow the computer to originate a phone call. What about the use of soft phones in a contact center? Would that be within the scope of an auto dialer? And I'm not going to come out and definitively say yes or no. I think that's something you'd have to assess with your own TCPA attorney. But the question does arise that if the FCC has said a smartphone is considered an auto dialer, then the question is, if you're using a soft phone in a contact center, how is that software running on a desktop computer fundamentally different from a smartphone? Can you make the argument that software can't be downloaded to the desktop computer? I think everyone recognizes that software can be readily downloaded to a computer. So I think that causes that question to be revisited with respect to whether that's an acceptable level of risk. Another question was asked about the ability of telecom providers to block numbers for customers on request. And there are 2 points to this. First of all, as many people know, many telephone carriers for many years have been offering a service where you can add a particular calling party number to a list and block calls from those numbers. That has been around for decades. I think everyone's going to recognize that's probably not an effective way to block robocalls, because the FCC is still encountering many complaints about Rachel from Cardholder Services originating calls and so forth. The FCC in its order gave the green light for the carriers to come up with some other mechanism, but it's unclear what that other mechanism would be, how it would be really effective on a large scale. And even if they were to come up with a new technology, the question is whether that would be acceptable to users or whether it can just be circumvented using other technology. So it remains to be seen whether or not that will actually come to fruition. So anyway, those are some of, Tom, those are some of the common questions that I received, and I hope I've addressed them, and I hope I've clarified people's questions as to how to minimize risk under the new TCPA order.
That's fantastic, Carl. So thank you very much. We will now conclude today's webinar, and I just want to thank everybody again for taking the time today. Thank you. Bye.